Tag TV, and Tag Radio. Technology now has a voice of innovation and information. Get it on www.tagtvonline.com. Rarely do we think about taxation having four major purposes: revenue, redistribution, repricing, and representation. We all know that taxes raise money to spend on roads, schools, and hospitals, indirect government functions like more market regulations and justice systems. In this year's recent political campaign, the issue of redistribution was hotly debated, transferring wealth from richer sections of society to the poorer sections. Most forget that taxation is also used to address externalities. Tobacco, for example, and more recently, much is being discussed about implementing a carbon tax. Finally, taxation from a historical perspective, representation. You remember the American Revolution slogan, "No taxation without representation"? Rulers tax citizens, citizens demand accountability from the rulers, the other part of the bargain. Greetings, everyone. It's Tuesday, November 25th, 2008, and this is Tech Talk with Technology Association of Georgia President Tino Mantella. On this edition, Tino takes a serious look at taxation, major developments from 2008, the crisis economy's impact on 2009, and just how business-friendly is Georgia when it comes to taxation as compared to its neighbors. Up to the subject is tax partner and CPA Brad Dickson. Brad has overall responsibility for managing the tax practice at Tarpley Underwood, one of Atlanta's leading full-service CPA firms. From international and multi-state taxation to IRS controversy and accounting for income taxes, Brad's over quarter century of experience has been primarily in business transaction and business taxation. He holds leadership positions on numerous international chambers of commerce and academic, professional, charitable, and civic organizations. He holds the prestigious recognition of a leadership member of the Georgia Society of CPA's taxation section, where he has chaired that section for the last 2 years. He recently received the 2008 Distinguished Member and was a former 2007 Distinguished Section Chair Award recipient. Taxation, that's today's Tech Talk focus on with Tino as he speaks with industry leader and Atlanta Distinguished CPA, tax partner at Tarpley and Underwood, Bradford C. Dickson.
Brad, thank you for joining me on Tech Talk.
My pleasure, Tino.
Well, let's jump right into this. Our listeners, certainly it's almost tax time again, and our listeners are going to be interested in hearing from you on some of the latest developments. So in 2008, were there any major changes or developments in Georgia's taxation policies?
Well, 2008 was an unusual year. There was a lot of politics going on. There was a lot of controversy about major tax reform, and obviously the beginning of 2008 was a very better time than we're in now at the end of 2008. So the whole environment was very different. It's unfortunate that there was, even though we had one majority party in control of the Georgia session, that there was a lot of infighting, obviously, and so the bottom line was there wasn't as much passed as what everyone hoped. A lot of small changes, but no major tax reform.
Well, you mentioned the economy. Of course, everybody is keenly aware of what's happening with our economy today, and our technology companies are hopefully positioning themselves to continue to be successful and continue to grow. Well, do you see the economic changes impacting 2009 tax legislation? Are there proposals coming up that you're aware of that would affect any kind of a change?
Oh, I think most definitely. Kind of the trend that was set really last year, and that is that there were a lot of specific credits passed. There were some changes that were actually made in sessions prior that were firmed up in 2008, but nothing extremely out of the norm. My expectation is that there'll be more of the same this year, and it should be interesting to see what happens this week in the Congress on a federal level, because I think that will kind of grease the wheel for what we'll see here in Georgia. if there's major reform attached to the bailout plan, I think it'll kind of show, kind of give us a hint as to what may happen in the '09 session as far as Georgia, whether or not there's going to be a consensus and bipartisanship and that kind of thing will kind of spill over to what happens here locally. So the next 2 weeks will be key. Georgia did enact a number of credits or enhanced credits for '08, and there was also kind of a rollout of legislation that passed earlier in '08. So there were some changes, but there wasn't the great tax reform that Speaker Richardson had talked about earlier.
Do you think with the state, the number has been bandied around between $1.5 billion and $2 billion in needs, that some of these tax credits that were created in past years, will they be rescinded, do you feel?
I doubt that. Georgia got smart several years ago, and as they started rolling out the credit regime, and we have a lot of credits, they started putting caps on most of them. So, and most of them are annual caps, and some are as low as $2 million, some are as high as $50 million, depending on what it is. One of the things that's very popular is the teleworker credit.
Right.
Not a lot of dollars. It's $2.5 million, I think, cap. That will expire absent an extension, and my expectation is that's a valid credit, and it's certainly pro-economy and pro-environment. So that's one that's expected to be at least pushed toward an extension.
Right. TAG would like to see that extended as well. I think many of our companies, are proponents of working from home, and certainly a tax benefit to them for allowing their employees to do that is something we see as beneficial. You mentioned federal, and I'm not familiar with your level of expertise on the federal side, but certainly anyone that was following the election and Joe the Plumber conversations heard this number, $250,000, and taxes on companies, more taxes on companies that earn more than that. How much do you have a sense as to if that's actually enacted or those changes are made? How many small companies that does impact?
Well, probably a lot more than at least the Democratic Party would tell you initially, but nobody knows. I mean, it depends on how it's written ultimately, whether or not it's a function of your AGI. Most pass-through businesses or small businesses are pass-through entities that the income of the partnership or the S corporation will flow through to the owners. So when you talk about individual tax, you really bring in a lot of business tax as well. No one knows where those levels will finally pan out, but the vast majority of what's considered a small business, makes revenue over $200,000, and included with that are other taxes besides income tax. The likelihood that payroll taxes may go up through Social Security matching or higher Social Security limits is very likely, but no one knows what those limits are and how high.
Okay, thank you. And then from a standpoint of Georgia and the belief that Georgia was at one time competitive and a business-friendly state when compared to, let's say, other states in the southeast, how do you think we stack up today?
Well, I would say from a corporate point of view, Georgia is still very friendly and a great place to locate. And there's several reasons for that. One of the things that was enacted in 2005 was what they call a single factor apportionment change. And it's been ratcheting down from a 1/3 ratio down to a 100% ratio for the sales factor. And what that means is if your business is headquartered in Georgia, that means your principal office is here. Then if you ship out of state or you do services for customers out of the state, then you will only allocate your income to Georgia based on the sales or services done in the state. And if you're mostly an exporter of those services, you'll pay virtually no tax here in Georgia under the new apportionment. And even though that was 2005 legislation changed it to the 100% sales, it's now effective in '09, making Georgia a very attractive headquarter state. Also, Georgia law doesn't have what they call a throwback rule, which many other states have, to say, well, okay, I'm a major exporter, but if I don't file a return in the other state, they throw back those sales into the headquarter state, saying that it's got to be taxed somewhere. Georgia doesn't have that, and therefore you can end up with kind of nowhere sales and nowhere tax. Also, Georgia is very favorable as far as consolidated returns. The election is fairly easy. There's no unitary provisions like other states have. There's minimal add-backs for intercompany. There are a few, but not like some of the other states. And Georgia's mostly linked to the federal system, which makes life a little easier. The two big exceptions are bonus depreciation and the differences in what they call the domestic production, or the 199 adjustment. So all those things make Georgia a fairly easy state to do business in. There's numerous credits that we've talked about, and there's been advantages on sales tax as well, which I think makes Georgia ahead of many of its neighbors.
TAG is in the final throes of putting together its legislative agenda for the next session in Georgia. And is there anything that comes to mind that you've been working on in the past few years that you think would be just a great addition to Georgia's laws?
Well, as a CPA, our organizations are involved from many different levels as far as taxation. The most important thing we can do is consult and be objective in what's being proposed. In rare cases, we will actually sponsor legislation as a practitioner, and in those cases, it's going to be about things that enhance the tax administration from a compliance point of view, meaning things to change how e-filing is done, things about penalties and things of that nature. When there are inequities in the law, we'll consult and we'll point out those inequities and help the legislatures frame a position, and that would include helping lobbyists and people in the TAG organization as well, consult and frame those issues. I would expect this year to be a tough year for legislation, and it's going to be, as you know, Georgia has to have a balanced budget.
Right.
Because of the shortfall, we can't, unlike the federal government, print money and just keep going and going. So, Georgia's going to have to make it work, and that means there'll be tough decisions on spending. And like I said, the feds might take the lead. If they say, well, in spite of the economy, I'm going to raise taxes. If they do something like that, it'd be interesting to see if Georgia jumps on board on that. I kind of doubt that's going to be the answer, but we may not know until after Inauguration Day, which I think is the 22nd of January.
So, we certainly it's been interesting observing some of the goings on during the election period here, and this Sarbanes-Oxley was either talked about directly or indirectly, and just with some of the things that have happened with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, even with the SOX in place, they don't necessarily always seem to catch the things that I think it was intended to do. So has it become a lot of effort and not necessarily the way that we should be going? A lot of our companies certainly are not ecstatic about what they've had to do over the last several years since the Enron days. So I guess another way to ask the question too, is it enforcement or better customer service that breeds better compliance? And what are your thoughts in general on that whole area?
Well, from a tax emphasis, the better enforcement and the better service is a direct quote from Nina Olson, who is the National Taxpayer Advocate. She said in order for the IRS to work its best, the laws have to be enforced, and there also has to be, friendly customer service and education involved in order to get the best answer and cure this big tax gap that we have out there. Commissioner Graham on the Georgia Department of Revenue has said the same thing, and his goal is to make the Georgia Department of Revenue work as efficiently or more efficient than any other state. That's his direct quote, and clearly there's a long way to go to make that happen. And the difficulty, and sometimes where we get involved in legislation, is truly to try to simplify what's out there. There's no effort on accountants' part to make life more complicated, and some people call it the Full Employment Act for accountants every time there's a tax law change. That is not our prerogative, I can assure you. We think a smooth financial system is going to have simplicity as a major part of what it's all about. I fear that additional regulations will be coming out, whether from a tax viewpoint or otherwise, and some of them really do hamper the small business owner particularly.
Well, Brad, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining me on Tech Talk, and let's wish us all luck in getting out of this economic challenges that we face today, and good luck on the continued success of your firm.
Thank you, Tino.